Dr. David Harvey, Director of Senate, Professor of the New York University, and also Dr. Thomas Purcell, Subdirector of Senate, Professor in Quito, Ecuador. Today, in our first session, we are going to have Professor David Harvey, whose conference is Desarrollo geográficos desiguales y producción del espacio. And even now, I give the floor to Claudia. Good afternoon. You're all very welcome to Camilo Torres Theater of our university, Antioquia University. We thank all teachers for being here and the support of teachers, students, and administrative of INER for organizing this event. The Institute of Regional Studies, INER, associated with the Anthropology Department of the Social Sciences Department of Antioquia University, has been creating since 2012 Hernán Henao Delgado lecture as a way to maintain alive the memory of this professor at university who understood the true meaning of university, producing knowledge and with a democratic project. This professor was killed in 1999 in his office in the 9th block, wanted to have a model of knowledge in which society was not the object of the question of the science, but it was the society who questions the science. So this way, the critic knowledge wanted to reflection and emit good knowledge and transforming local versions of our societies. This lecture is a space for dialogue about social sciences and its contribution to the problems and challenges that we have in this moment. In 2015 and 2016, the topic of this event is going to be methodologies and policies about knowledge. And we want to identify new proposals to produce knowledge and generate reflection and thinking about the power relationships that condition these proposals. It is about to balance the relations and power effects and the policies about knowledge in society and also vice versa. The knowledge about policies and power. We want to work and we work for an ideal in which our methodologies are maintained independent and allow us to produce knowledge that affects and is reflected in society and politics. The field of knowledges in which we want to reflect in these 2 years are the following: new cartographies, dialogues of knowledge, production of knowledge, visual narratives, methodologies of urban planning and territorial organization, regional focuses, comparative studies, and intersectionalities. This event is also related to the preparation of the Latin American Conference and the Caribbean Conference about social sciences that is going to be held in Medellin in November this year, and in which axes of reflections are going to be the democratic transformations, social justice, and peace processes. These times are a challenge from all fields of knowledge to find spaces of hope, important points and horizons of crisis that mean social changes that are powerful. This conference is going to be inspiring in this sense. The challenges that citizens face, social movements face, and also governments face allow us to think and invite us to think in a social special manner. Thanks to our guest, we're going to inaugurate these conferences, hoping to create ideals focused in a deep, creative, innovative, and systematic way. Before presenting Professor Harvey and expressing how important his visit is for our university and our city, I want to give the floor to Dr. Thomas Purcell, Subdirector of the National Center of National Territory, part of the Institute of High Institutes, National Institutes of the National Postgrad University in Ecuador, whose director is Professor Harvey. Hello. Hello everyone, and thank you very much, Claudia, and the university for this invitation. I am Thomas Purcell, Director of CNED in Quito. Maybe, as you already know, I am not from Latin America. I'm from Manchester. I'm an English person, and I visited Quito a year ago with David in order to think in a center of the territorial studies, but with a different point of view, let's say. Something that is very important for us is intellectual production and also theoretical and social, with an international level of academy. But the most important for the center is to think in practical alternatives for public policies and also for communities in urban centers and also in the fields. We are a group of materialistic people. We work under the umbrella of the uneven geographical development, which is the biggest contribution of Harvey's knowledge and thinking. We are a team with 12 people formed by architects, economists, anthropologists, feminists that work together, and the idea was to create a center interdisciplinary, and I said this, it's not the same as interdisciplinary, it's transdisciplinary, but it's a center to think further the structures that are not only in the universities, but also in the capitalist societies, and this is why I think it's a very privileged space, but also with limits, and it's our hope to create further connections further than Ecuador and Latin America, and this is why we're here learning the urban conditions in Colombia. And today we were in the comunas talking to their inhabitants, where obviously you're not here to listen to me, but you're here to listen to Professor Debbie. I just want to say that if someone wants to speak a little bit more about our center, I am totally open to speak about our research and give more details about it. And I will also give you our website. Thank you very much. As we already know, we had a limited number of listeners for the translation. Well, we suggest you to share the earphones with your partners, with the people that you have beside, so other people can have the opportunity of listening to the translation. Try to reconstruct these minutes the trajectory of David. Is a difficult task because he has done so much, and it's also maybe useless because maybe most of you know it. Nevertheless, I am going to try to do it. Professor Harvey was born in Kenton, England. He's an anthropologist, geographist, and social theorist. Since 2001, he teaches anthropology in New York, and he has visited so many other universities in the world. One of his huge contributions can be expressed in his bet for the geographical materialism and for the theory of uneven geographical development of capitalism, also reading The Capital by Marx, demonstrating the spatial divisions, the social struggles, and the accumulation of capital. The uneven geographical developments are an exposure of the social phenomena connected to capitalism without solutions, and they cannot survive without special solutions. Colonialism, among others, are accumulations by depossession in which territories and resources get at the service of accumulation at the expenses of huge populations. The accumulation of capital, from his perspective, is the production of space, and for this accumulation is about the production of new spaces, of the colonization of spaces. Professor Harvey is one of the very well known exposure of the radical philosophy, and this is why he's very interested in movements and social struggles. He's worried about the expressions of the economic system, and he wants to understand the city and the neighborhoods as symptoms of the uneven spatial relationships, injustice, and exclusion. But this same very worry takes him to formulate another bet for hope spaces in which ideals and space configurations are alternatives to the capitalist system. In his work, Rebel Cities, from the city to the urban revolution, he speaks about the social movements, and he speaks about why cities as a collective right and not individual rights. In the 17 Contradictions and the End of Capitalism, he speaks about the counterforces that are always present in the economic system, according to him, the social movements and the politic forces that struggle for a different world, that are anti-systems and transformational, should make better diagnosis in order to explain the social reproduction of our current societies, in order to find tendencies for crisis and what to do about it. For academics of this city and also for activists, social movements, students, the presence of this professor is inspiring. It doesn't matter if we have other experiences or if of our place in this city. David shares with us his knowledge about global phenomenon and the structures that we have in our daily lives. The importance of his visit in Medellin is because he illustrates with a global sense and with a systematic sense the local phenomenon that we see, so we can understand them from our own history. Why is Medellin growing in his periphery? How is decentralization in the downtown of the city? How, at the same time, do we have the interest of the housing sector with the public politics of furniture in the whole city? How do we make environmental sustainability, guaranteeing sustainability for all citizens? How do we change the massive transportation with a better mobility for environmental sustainability? How are paradigms changing and our behavior changing? How are they connected with the growing of the city? How is Medellin shouldn't planify itself, but also along with other municipalities and also states of the country? Why is our city growing further than its limits, concentrating not only wealth but also public services and public?
Seguramente el profesor se llevará un panorama de una ciudad que resiste a décadas de violencia.
A place in which we have social expressions and artistic expressions, as all metropolises do, but with deep roots connected with social exclusions in many stages. A city has a lot of frontiers, but also resistances and hopes. A city that has some contradictions, but it has good transportation, good education, and also good entertainment. Let's hope that our dialogue with him allows to deepen our knowledge, because I think that we have a common point besides the criticism of the capitalism, and it is that the deep knowledge of its functioning and its structures is maybe the only thing that is going to allow us to identify points of escape crisis, points to escape crisis, and points to find resistances, spaces of hope to find a dignity in our life for everyone. Thank you very much. Please remember that we're going to have a simultaneous interpretation by the translation agency of the university, the volume, and please remember to make your questions in a clear way in order to be interpreted and understood. We are going to have some papers for you to write the questions so we can summarize them to the professor. Check the number of your radios so you can give them back later on, and the same place in which you took it. If you have problems with it, please outside the hall find staff that will help you. After the conference, please give the radio back in the same place in which you took it, using the number of the radio. Please don't roll the headphones. The staff of the translation agency is going to receive the headphones until 6:30. Now let's give the floor to Professor Harvey.
Thank you. It's a great privilege to be here speaking in a public university. I teach in a very large public university in New York City with over 400,000 students. And I think the principle of public education is vital. And I think all public education should be free. It should not be a commodity. Now, I've just written a book called 17 Contradictions and the End of Capitalism. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the major ideas in that book, and particularly take up the question of their geographical manifestations. Now, contradiction is, I think, something that needs to be explained at the outset. A logical contradiction means that something either is or is not. But I use the Hegelian Marxist definition of contradiction, which is a tension within a situation, within a process, which is pulling it in opposed directions. Most people in the course of their lives find a very serious contradiction, tension, between their desire to have a very open and satisfying personal life, and at the same time the desire to have the money that goes with having a good job. Sometimes that contradiction becomes so tense that people go crazy. A lot of the time, most of us manage it. I personally try to have a good life at the same time as I do my academic job, but you can't do both at the same time. Though as an academic, I sometimes find ways actually to do both at the same time, which is a great pleasure. So a contradiction is something of that sort. Marx uses the concept of contradiction to understand why capitalism is so crisis-prone. He actually suggested that crises are a moment where many contradictions come together. So if society goes through a crisis, as we did in the United States and many other parts of the world in 2008, then the question you ask is, what were the contradictions that gave rise to this crisis? And in thinking through that, it seemed to me important to start to look at the structure of the contradictions and how they relate to each other. There are, I think, a number of entry points into this. But the one I want to emphasize at the outset here is this: that we live in a world where many people are very concerned about social and environmental issues. Many people are concerned about global poverty and global inequalities. And many people are concerned about environmental degradation, climate change, and the like. What distresses me about the discussions of social inequality and climate change is that most of the discussions are about how to clean up the results of social inequality or climate change. There's actually very little discussion of the processes that produce social inequality and climate change. And there is absolutely no inclination on the part of all of the big conferences that go on these topics to say something like, if you want to solve this problem of social inequality, we have to control, if not abolish, the process that gives rise to that social inequality. If we are concerned about environmental degradation, then we have to abolish or contain the process that gives rise to that environmental degradation. Now, this question of are we going to look at the processes that give rise to something, or are we simply going to try to ameliorate, soften the consequences of that process? That is one way of looking at a contradictory response. In my own work, I've been very concerned to try to identify the processes that give rise to social inequality and poverty, and very concerned also to look at the processes that give rise to environmental degradation and climate change. Now, for many years, I really didn't understand what those processes might be. But then I recognized sometime in the middle of when I was 35 years old, I think it was, that maybe what I should be looking at should be the structure of capitalism and what capital was about. Because I'd seen in the 1950s, and again in the 1960s, and again in the 1970s, I'd seen the claim made that the best way to abolish global poverty and global inequality was to unleash the forces of the market, to unleash the forces of entrepreneurial capitalism, and that would solve the problem. But then I started to think, well, maybe I should look at those solutions. And of course, Marx looks at those solutions and tells you straight away that actually the processes that give rise to social inequality are those of free markets and capital. What Volume 1 of Capital explains to you is that if you set up a free and perfect market, and if society works according to the rules and laws of private property arrangements supported by state power, then what happens is not what Adam Smith predicted. Adam Smith said, let the market do its work, and everybody will be better off. The hidden hand of the market, he said, will ensure that. But what Marx shows is that the hidden hand of the market produces a situation in which the rich grow richer and the poor grow much poorer. Now, up until 1970 or so, we lived in a world of social democracy, an advanced capitalist world anyway, of social democracy and considerable power of labor. And we did not see the rich getting super rich and the poor getting poorer. But after 1970, there was this revolution in thought, which we call neoliberalism, which said that system does not work. We need to go back to the purity of a capitalist system in which the market is left to do its work. Everything shall be bought and sold as a commodity. And of course, since 1970, those policies have been pursued quite successfully. Labor has been disempowered globally. And the consequence has been tremendous concentration of wealth and power in the top 1%, and even more concentration of wealth and power in the top 0.1%. And recently a book came out by this French economist, Piketty, in which he demonstrated statistically that that indeed was what had happened worldwide. That is what tends to happen, except in those periods, like in the Second World War and its aftermath, when society organizes itself along different lines. So social inequality then is a product of a pure capitalist system. And yet we are told that the best answer to social inequality is to unleash that capitalist system. In other words, we're invited to embrace the process that gives rise to social inequality as the means by which we will get rid of social inequality. That is a crazy proposition. And therefore, what we have to do is to actually start to question the process that produces social inequality. And that process is, of course, the circulation of capital. And what Marx does in his texts is to analyze in detail the laws of motion of the circulation and accumulation of capital, and show the consequences that derive from such a system. I don't have a chance here to talk about all of the contradictions that are involved, but the one that I really would want to emphasize is one of the most dangerous contradictions of the present time. which is simply that capital has to expand in order to survive. Capital is a system of accumulation for accumulation's sake, and that the accumulation of capital has to grow more and more and more. And actually the way it grows more is by a process of compound growth or exponential growth. That is, 3% compound growth means that you double the size of an economy every 25, 30 years. Now, if you look in the financial press and say, what is a respectable rate of economic growth? People, you'll find, are satisfied if it is 3%. That's okay. 4% is good growth. 5% is, very good. But get below 3% and people start to say capitalism is in trouble. Get to 0% and capitalism is in crisis. So capital is about growth. And it grows at this exponential rate, like this, goes like this. Starts slowly and then it doubles and doubles and doubles and then it goes like this. The famous illustration of compound growth is the case of the person who invented the game of chess, and he was asked by the king or sultan or whoever it was, what reward did he want? And he said, put 1 grain of rice on the first square of the chessboard, then double it on the second, and double it again on the third. And the king said, yeah, no problem, I'll do that. The trouble was, by the time you got to the 21st square, you'd used up all the rice in the world. Where you'd be at in the 64th square is in some infinite universe that you couldn't possibly find in existence. The story goes that the king was so mad when he found out about this, he had the inventor of chess executed, but we don't know if that's apocryphal story or not. But my point is that compound growth is very dangerous after a certain period. 3% compound growth in 1850, when capital was really about what was going on in Britain, a few parts of Europe, and a few parts of the United States. Really no big problem. But now you're looking at a compound rate of growth on everything that's going on in North America and Europe, but Japan, most of South Asia, all of China, and of course most of Latin America. So you're looking at a huge, huge problem of how to keep compound growth going. Now, there are a number of ways in which capital has satisfied its requirement for compound growth. One of the ways that contradiction is dealt with is by geographical expansion, geographical reconfiguration. And so you get something that I often refer to as the spatial fix to capitalist problems. That is, a fix in the sense of you solve the problem. Britain produced a great deal of capital and was expanding very fast in the 19th century. What did it do with its surplus capital? It had to find some place to put it. It could not be absorbed in Britain. It was impossible. So a lot of capital left Britain, and it went to places like Argentina, it went to places like Australia, it went, of course, most of all, to the United States. So the solution to the surplus of capital that was emerging in Britain was to engage in various colonial practices and imperialist practices. Now, there are two kinds of imperialism, colonialism. One is a settler colonialism, like the United States or Australia. The other is an occupying colonialism. So Britain occupied India. It needed India for its markets. To whom was it going to sell all the goods it was producing on an increasing rate in Manchester, all the cloth in Manchester? Well, it could sell it to India, provided that you destroyed all Indian industry. So the British destroyed all Indian industry and then sold all the Indians cloth made in Manchester. Neat solution to the expansion problem. But actually, it's not a very good solution, because an oppressed India is not going to develop and is not going to be dynamic. The market is fixed. How was India going to pay for all of that cloth? Well, it could export raw materials to Britain, which it did, and the British made sure it got its raw materials. But that wasn't enough. So India had to find another way to pay for all of the goods that the British were producing. And the British imperial authorities came up with a great plan. Sell opium to China. So they got the Indians to grow opium, sold it to China, which the Chinese didn't like very much, and take all the silver out of China. So silver came from China to India, and then from India to Britain. This is a very stagnant kind of imperial system. The other system, which is the colonial system, is much more vibrant. Send surplus capital to the United States. Invest in railways, invest in industrial development. And that then generated demand for British steel, British locomotives, British goods of all kinds, because you had a dynamic economy which was itself growing at a compound rate. So the Indian solution was a stagnant solution in the long run. The United States solution was a dynamic solution to the British problem. But the problem with the dynamic system is that it starts to produce surpluses. Where do the surpluses go? So the United States started an internal process of development, of geographical displacement, which continued until after World War II, when Texas and California suddenly became really big parts of this capitalist dynamic. But it too, at a certain point, became a center of accumulation which competed with Britain and actually, in the end, supplanted Britain. After World War II, the United States had a lot of surplus capital. It did a very sensible thing with it from the standpoint of capitalist development. It gave or lent at very low rates a lot of capital to rebuild Europe and Japan. And that rebuilding generated global demand for American goods, and so American goods did very well, and the American economy did very well because the United States sent a lot of money to Europe and Japan. It rebuilt the economies of Germany and Japan. But by the time you get to 1980, what's the situation? Germany and Japan have become such efficient economies that they start to compete with the United States. The United States starts to feel real serious pressure in exactly the way that Britain had felt serious pressure from the United States 50 years before. But it wasn't only Germany and West Germany and Japan that were being great in this. The second was that many other places started to do the same thing. South Korea, Taiwan. But then suddenly they started to produce surpluses. What were they to do? Korean industry and Taiwanese started to export capital at a very rapid rate after 1975 or so. And then China enters this field, because a lot of that capital from Korea and Taiwan goes to China. But then China enters the field. China now has a lot of surplus capital. What is China going to do? Well, it's become extremely active in Latin America. Ecuador has a problem right now with the oil price. Okay, China will lend them the money, use its surplus capital. But what is it going to get back? It's going to get back oil and, to some degree, a privileged access to that particular market. So the surplus capital problem, when you look at this history, is surplus capital is washing around the world, moving from one space to another. And each space it moves into, if it is allowed to develop in a dynamic way, then produces more surplus capital that has to be used somewhere else. The situation right now, as I suggested, is that actually the amount of surplus capital out there, looking for some place to go to develop, is huge. What is it going to do in all of these countries? Now, one of the answers is, well, it can actually develop new industrial capacity, as happened as United States capital went into China, so that at a certain point General Motors, Ford, and surplus capital from Germany like Volkswagen, they're all producing in China. So it can do that kind of thing. But I think the most important point about all this is to say that the geographical fluidity of capital is in fact absolutely crucial to the solution of this problem of where does the surplus capital go. The world has to be open. So what do we see? We see institutions created which are about trying to make sure that there are no barriers to capital flow between one part of the world and another. What are the typical barriers to capital flow? Nationalism, tariffs, peculiar constraints on currency and the like. And after 1945, the United States started to say, our policy is to force upon the world open trade. So we get the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which eventually became the World Trade Organization, which is about global free trade. Dismantle all of those barriers. And the United States had the power to impose upon countries that they dismantle those barriers. So the political barriers to global change became a target. Open the world. We were told globalization is a great thing. Free trade is a great thing. At the same time as all kinds of political, economic, and in some instances military pressure was put on countries in order to ensure free trade. But there's another barrier to this, and that barrier is transport costs. Now, transport costs provide a measure of the spatiality of capital accumulation. High transport costs protect industries in localities. In the 19th century, very high transport costs meant that certain goods could only be produced at the site of the market. My favorite example of this is beer. In the 19th century, almost all beer was produced in the city in which it was consumed. Beer was a very heavy good, wasn't easy to preserve it, and if it spent too much time traveling, it went sour. So all beers were local beers. And that continued to the point where, as a young kid who went drinking beer illegally in my hometown, the only beer I could drink was the beer from my hometown. But by the time I got through college, I started to notice something. In the 1960s, other beers started to come into town. I started to find beers not from my local town, but from other local towns. I even found Guinness, an Irish beer, in my local town. And that was because transport costs were declining. When I went to live in the United States in 1969, you knew which city you were in by what beer you were drinking. If you drank something called Iron City, you knew you were in Pittsburgh. If you drank something called National Bohemian, you knew you were in Baltimore. But by the time you get to the 1970s, all of that disappears. And we were getting beer from Colorado, from Wisconsin, and then all of a sudden foreign beers. And pretty soon, beer became international. Now, what was it that went on? That a protected monopoly market of beer in the 19th century suddenly became a global market. It wasn't tariffs or anything like that, though that did have something to do with it. The main thing was the changing structure of transport costs. And there was one single innovation that made a huge, huge difference, which was containerization. The big containers that allow you to take something, put it in the container is on a truck, the container is loaded on a ship, the container goes on the ship, it's loaded onto a truck, and it goes to its destination. The space relations of global trade dramatically changed with containerization in exactly the same way that the spatial relations of global trade changed with the coming of the railroads and the coming of steam power on the ships. Now this principle is, I think, something very important about the nature of capitalism. You see, capital accumulates in part in relationship to its turnover time. How long does it take for capital to start off as a bit of money, go into the market, buy means of production and labor power, go into production, produce a commodity, take that commodity to market and sell it? How long does it take? And if I can do it in 5 days and you take 3 weeks, I beat you in competition. So there's tremendous competition to accelerate turnover time. Go as fast as you can, produce as fast as you can, market it as fast as you can. And this principle was understood by Marx way, way back, when he talked about the compulsion under capitalism to annihilate space through time. That is, to reduce spatial barriers. So the physical costs of movement and what we geographers refer to the relative spaces of the global economy are being dramatically revolutionized by technological changes. And then you think, how many technological changes in the history of capitalism have been about either diminishing spatial barriers or accelerating speed of turnover. You look at all of the innovations in transport and communications, and you say, this has been a tremendous arena in which capital has connected its need to expand and expand and expand with this increasing acceleration, both in space and time, of capital circulation. So the world becomes smaller and smaller in the sense that getting from here to there costs less and less. And you start to see all of a sudden radical transformations in the division of labor. You could not have here in Colombia a vast export of flowers without those revolutions in transport and communications. If it took you 3 weeks to get the flowers from Colombia to New York, which it did take back in the 1960s, you'd have no flower industry. When you have jet transport, you can get it there in 24 hours. You can take perishable items, transport them easily. So in New York supermarkets, we get raspberries from Guatemala, all kinds of things that you just couldn't get in the 1950s or the 1960s because the transport system didn't exist for it. So the global division of labor starts to get radically transformed. With that, of course, consumption patterns get radically transformed. And all of this is about the spatial reorganization of the relative spaces of the global economy. And it's through that spatial reorganization that we start to find an ability to actually deal with the overaccumulating capital. At the same time as you're dealing with that, you can also deal with the question of labor relations. For example, if you read the press in Europe and the United States in the late 1960s, most of the financial press was complaining that labor had far, far too much power. Not only did they have power in the workplace, power of trade unions and labor organization, they also had political parties, social democratic political parties in Europe, even the Democratic Party in the United States, which was very much connected to powerful labor organizations. And for that simple reason, labor was able to gain a larger and larger share of the total national product. Capitalists didn't like it. They found their profit rates were actually lowered by the fact that labor was too powerful. So how do you get labor to be less powerful? Well, there are all sorts of ways. One of the ways, interestingly, which I think now capital regrets, was to encourage migration, in-migration. The Germans said to Turkish laborers, come to Germany. The Swedes said to people from Yugoslavia, come from Yugoslavia. The British said to the remnants of their empire, come. The French actually organized, with state subsidies, the whole import of labor from North Africa. Now, this was a way of attacking the power of resident labor. But it didn't work very well for all sorts of reasons. So if you can't bring labor to capital, then take capital to where labor is. In order to do that, you needed a fluid way in which to take capital from one part of the world to another. Now, the interesting thing when you analyze this is that capital has different forms. It exists as money. It exists as a commodity. It exists as a production process. And you look at those three forms and you say, which one of those is most easily moved around the world? Well, the money form is the easiest, particularly if the money form is increasingly not gold or something like that, but the money form is simply dollars. And if the money form can also be represented by electronic means. So electronic monies are extremely easy to move around the world, provided that there are no barriers of capital controls or anything of this kind. So one of the things that capital reformed in the 1970s was allow the money form as much freedom as possible, both within a country, reforms inside of the United States, but also internationally. Because then that allowed capital to flow to wherever the labor was cheapest. How did General Motors get all of its production into China? Translation of the money form. Take the money. Commodities are also mobile, but nowhere near as fast and easily as the money form. So capital revolutionized financial markets in the 1970s, 1980s. And in 1985, I think it was, there was something called the Big Bang. And the Big Bang was the unification of the global stock markets and financial markets, which gave money capital tremendous ability to move things around the world. The result of which was that money capital led to the deindustrialization of much of the advanced capitalist world. In Britain, there were industrial cities like Manchester, Sheffield, Leeds. All of them lost their industrial employment in about 10 years. Same thing happened in the United States. Pittsburgh, Detroit, Baltimore, Cleveland, all the industrial cities lost all of their industrial employment. Same thing in Germany and France. It even happened in India. The textile industry of Mumbai disappeared in the late 1980s, early 1990s. So deindustrialization in one part of the world and reindustrialization of China, where the labor costs were very low, and then Southeast Asia and some other places like Mexico and so on, maquila programs and all the like, that became possible. But again, notice something. It was the reform of capitalist financial system and the reform of the international system that allowed the migration of capital to where labor was cheapest, and this was one of the big ways in which labor was disciplined. And disciplining labor meant that capital had much higher profits. That's what this was all about. So that you start to see a reorganization of the global economy along these lines. But it's not simply the reorganization of the global economy of production. You also have to actually reorganize the global economy of consumption. Because one of the big contradictions that I analyze in the book is between production and realization of capital. You produce capital, but in order for that capital that's been produced to maintain its value, you need to have an effective demand, you need to have a market. The capital has to be realized. If it's not realized, said Marx, it's destroyed. So the contradictory union between production and realization of capital becomes a critical question. So capital had successfully reorganized production, but what about where was it going to realize that production? The automobile industry was one of those industries which expanded at this compound rate of growth through geographical expansion. So General Motors and Ford and Volkswagen all go to China. Parts of them also go to Latin America and so on, Sao Paulo or wherever. But if those production industries go there, then how are those automobiles going to be used? If you don't have highways, if you don't have a middle class that can buy automobiles. So the whole consumption side has to be reorganized. And this is a complicated story, but there's one aspect of it which stands out. I've been asked several times, when was I last in Colombia, if I was? And the answer was, I was here in 1972. It actually turns out that I was not only in Colombia, I was in cities like Recife in Brazil and Salvador in Brazil in 1972. And I remember what it was like in 1972. And I wasn't in Medellin, but I was in Bogota and I was in Cali. And actually I took a bus all around Colombia, crazy bus drive all around Colombia for 10 days down to the Ecuador border and back. This is a completely different country now. The thing that struck me about going to Salvador in Brazil, I remember the beach and sort of there were huts along the beach and people living close to the beach. Now it looks like an imitation of Miami. Go to Panama and it looks like an imitation of Miami. Every city I go to has a huge kind of building boom. And in fact, urbanization, since the 1970s, has been one of the fantastic ways in which not only production but consumption has been revolutionized in a way that can handle this question of compound growth. In fact, there's been a compound growth of urbanization. Now, the forces behind that compound growth of urbanization are very complicated. It includes, of course, the destruction of peasant agriculture and the rise of industrialized agricultural production systems, which leads to the displacement of peasant populations who flood into the cities. Then the city development is partly about accommodating that flood of rural migrants, but the other part of it is about accommodating the massive amount of surplus capital looking for something to do. Now, what does capital do with the surplus capital in urbanization? It builds. Who does it build for? Does it build affordable housing and decent schools for people? No. What is it like to build? It loves to build mega projects. Every municipality around the world loves a mega project. So things like the World Cup, Olympic Games, you name it, municipalities love it because the developers love it, the construction interests love it, the financiers love it. This is a great way to actually get surplus capital employed. And that's what they do. So urbanization suddenly becomes one of the big features of how the world is being organized in the 1970s and 1980s. So that when I arrive in Salvador, as I did about a year ago, I just totally don't recognize this city, nor did I recognize Recife at all. So the urbanization story fits into the ways in which this contradiction of compound growth in a finite world gets managed. I really like that way of thinking. And of course, this then has macroeconomic consequences. The United States was in a difficult situation in 2001. There had been a stock market crash, and the difficulty was, where was the surplus capital going to go? So, the Federal Reserve reduced interest rates. Interest rates go down very low. What is the effect of reducing interest rates? Mortgages and finance of long-term capital investment projects become much easier to get. And the result of that is you get a housing boom. Now, housing is very interesting because finance, which has been set up as being the center of capital accumulation after the 1970s, finances the production of housing, but it also finances the consumption of housing by offering cheap debt to people. So you get this nice circular kind of thing. We lend money to the developer has to sell the building, so we lend money to the consumer so they can buy the building. Developers get a lot of profit, financiers get a lot of profit. It goes on fine until somebody recognizes that people are so in debt they cannot pay, and the housing bubble crashes as it did in 2008. But what was the response to this crisis globally? Well, one of the responses was, guess what? Not to control that process, but to geographically displace it. The big stabilizer in the world economy since 2008 has been China. What has China done to actually absorb all of this surplus capital? Urbanize. About 50% of the Chinese growth since 2008 has been absorbed through rapid urbanization, huge urbanization project. And it's not only a huge urbanization project, but it also means a huge demand for raw materials. So any country that was producing raw materials for the Chinese urbanization boom did well. Australia hardly felt the crisis. Chile, demand for copper, came out of the crisis, not much problem. Most of Latin America has turned itself into a soybean plantation for the China trade and didn't feel the crisis that much. So what you see here is a kind of a story of geographical shifts and displacements, movements around the world. The crisis tendencies of capital get moved around, I argue, because they get moved around geographically. United States in deep crisis in 2008. China gets hit by it because export industries, but China compensates and capital accumulation on a global scale can resume. But in exactly the same way that in the United States early in 2000 and so, excess flow of capital into the housing market generated a crisis, so we see some crisis tendencies emerging throughout the world. Now this analysis really flows from moving from one contradiction to another. Contradiction of production, a contradiction which affects the realization. Solution is urbanization, generates another crisis. In other words, crises move around, and they move from one contradiction to another. At one minute, the contradiction is between capital and labor, as it was at the end of the 1960s. Another, it's between production and realization, as it was in the 1930s. Another is that it starts to be between resource constraints, I haven't really talked about environmental constraints, and others. So we start to see this moving around. So that the geographical dimensions to this are crucial. You have to look where the crisis is now. Where is it going? And, you know, 2 years ago in Brazil, everybody was saying, things are great. Sorry about you folk, we're doing great. But look at Brazil now, close to zero growth, not doing great at all, and everybody's getting very nervous. So you never know when it's going to hit you. And yet these global processes, like urbanization, are constantly being reinvented. Mega projects being reinvented. Consumerism being pushed to absorb the surpluses. This is the sort of analysis, it seems to me, which we need to have. And against that background, that we of course see patterns of urban resistance, urban revolts. Brazil over the last couple of years. Turkey. All of this process generates a great deal of social distress, social movement, which I haven't had time to talk about, but which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. So look at the contradictions. Think about them. Look at the process. And the reason I'm an anti-capitalist is because I see most of the problems that we face right now cannot be answered within the dynamics of a capitalist system. That we need to look for and think about an alternative. With that thought, I will leave you because we want to have some time for discussion and questions. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias al profesor Harvey.
Thank you very much, Professor Harvey. Now we will have some questions from the public to the professor. On one side, what do you think about the Tobin tax?
Do you know that? Yes. Okay.
The other question is there any solution in the regions to this capitalist system? Could we have regional solutions to this capitalist system? And finally, for cities like Medellin, what are the alternatives in this economic model that commands the world today?
I think the Tobin tax is a very minor adjustment within the dynamics of the system. I don't think it will do very much to deal with the problems that I've talked about. Regional solutions, well, part of what I've been talking about is the way in which uneven geographical development provides ways in which capital can escape from some of its difficulties. If, for example, the United States is in difficulty and China is booming, then the global system can be in equilibrium. We saw situations of this kind in the 19th century when booms in Britain were matched by depressions in the United States, depressions and booms in the United States were matched by depressions in Britain. So you can get uneven geographical development, the moving around of the crisis tendencies, and that has been a very important way in which global capital has stabilized itself. But one of the dangers of that is, of course, the emergence of regional configurations which start to compete with each other. This happened in the 1930s when the different empires started to close doors, and so we then got into geopolitical conflicts. There are many people now who look at the situation and say that this compensating movement can only work if there is a hegemonic power, a dominant power. And all the time the United States was dominant, it could work. But we're now seeing the emergence of what you might call regional hegemonies. That in Europe, for example, Germany is obviously hegemonic in terms of the European Union. In North America, United States, obviously. In Latin America, Brazil. In East Asia, China. So we start to see regional hegemonic groups. And those regional hegemons may get in conflict with each other. And that was what produced the Second World War. There are signs of conflict between the United States and China in the Pacific. You would hope that people were sensible enough to avoid any kind of global conflict of that sort, but we have seen that that is not always the case. So the regionalization of this, if it starts to become closed and competitive, and we see that China is being very competitive here in Latin America. Latin American countries are much more oriented to the China trade now than they were. And we start to see China being very aggressive in Africa and also throughout much of South Asia. And the United States compensating for that, so there is, and then there's always the problem of what is Russia going to do, so the regional powers are beginning to look, in one sense, rather dangerous. I don't see regionalization as a solution. Actually, to the degree that regions close themselves off, actually they're likely to get into greater and greater trouble rather than if they maintain themselves open. So I don't see that as a solution. Here in Medellin, what do? You live here, you should answer that question. I can't tell you what to do. I think, however, that obviously what I see around the world are some very interesting forms of social movement. The social movements over the last 15 years have been very different. There are obviously new ways of doing politics. Many of the social movements that have occurred have not been based on workplace discontents. Many of them have been based on discontents with the qualities of urban life. So that I suspect if there are going to be major changes through social movements, it's going to be around the question of the qualities of urban life. This was central in the Brazil protests. It was central in Gezi Park protests in Turkey. That we have seen these eruptions in London and Stockholm, Paris. We've seen some in the United States. So actually, daily life in the city can actually be the center of a lot of protests. And in particular, the kinds of protests which go against the ways in which local governments and regional governments and national governments spend much of their time supporting capital rather than people. I mean, the big rule of neoliberalism was that the role of the state was to create a good business climate, which means that if there is a conflict between the creation of a good business climate and the well-being of the people, you choose a good business climate. Similarly, the rule of neoliberalism is if there is a conflict between saving the banks and saving the people, you save the banks. And let the people pay the cost. This is what we've seen in the United States. We bailed out the banks, but we didn't bail out the people. We put the people deeper and deeper into debt, and the like. So this is the kind of neoliberal strategy, and it has not stopped. Some people say, oh, the crisis meant the end of neoliberalism. No. Actually, the crisis has deepened neoliberalism, and the best way you can see that is, since 2008, the concentrations and centralizations of wealth and power in the world have grown even more significantly lopsided. In other words, the top 1% globally has done extremely well out of the crisis. Their secret phrase is, never let a good crisis go to waste. And they've used the crisis very effectively to create even more wealth for themselves. So I think that one of the things we have to do is to think about mobilizing around the question of urbanization more emphatically, to the degree that there are urban social movements here in Medellin and elsewhere in Colombia. I think that we should be supporting them and arguing that this is the way in which there's going to be very serious changes in the world coming out of urban social movements, because the labor movement is not dead by any means, but that the labor movement has been far too much emphasized by the left as opposed to daily life issues in neighborhoods and in communities. So my advice would be, try to put together labor and struggles in the community, and don't prioritize one over the other, and try to get a collective movement together which can do more than what we've seen, which is eruptions in cities which last only a week or 3 weeks or 4 weeks and then decline. We need some sort of more permanent agenda as to what it is we're looking for. And I think that that is one of the ways we should be thinking about the role of social struggle in relationship to anti-capitalist politics.
Hay un grupo de preguntas
There are some more questions
que se refieren
referring to
habrá un capitalismo
about
más humano.
having a more human capitalism. Is it possible to have a urban revolution and the real exercise of the urban rights in the middle of this economic model? And in this sense, there are three questions that have to do with perspectives, with theoretical perspective and different points of view to this that you have shared with us today. What is the role of the countries of the socialism of the 21st century? Brazil, Ecuador, Bolivia on the one side. On the other side, what opinion do you have about the theories of James R. Robinson and, I don't know how to pronounce this, Acemoglu, a text that says, why are the countries failing where the geographic theses are neglected? And they said they are the elite, and the way in which politics are done, they say it's the reason why the crisis exists. On the other side, what are your interpretations about Lefebvre's ideas? Lefebvre's ideas about the healthcare. Those relating to different points of view, related and also very far away from your points of view. And on the other side, in terms of the city, Medellin, as you know, has lived violent decades. Our country has had an armed country for many decades. What is the role of this? What is the variable? How is this a variable in this analysis? Have you ever seen a case like Colombian in which the armed country has a lot of effect in our economic dynamics? Those are the questions.
Yeah, there's a very interesting debate in economics over whether geography matters. And writers like Jeffrey Sachs say, yes, it does, it's very crucial. Acemoglu and his companions say basically that's wrong, that the most important thing are institutional arrangements. What drives me crazy is that they never read anything that geographers actually write. For me, geography is not simply the physical environment. It's the landscape that we make. The state is a geographical fact. Geographical organization of populations is not dictated by climate, necessarily. I mean, you know, when Jeffrey Sachs says geography matters, what he does is essentially say distance from the equator and distance from navigable water explains something like, I don't know what it is, 70% of the variation in GDP per capita. That's crazy. You know. So I just wish that they would read, you know, what some of us write about the production of space. They would read Neil Smith on the production of nature. The geographical world which we live in is largely a product of human action. It's not simply about, you know, climatic stuff. Soil conditions, for example, have been affected by, you know, human occupation and human activity for, you know, thousands of years. So, you know, I just think the concept of geography in economic theory is just way, way off what any of us geographers would ever talk about. Sorry, I've got to get some. Yeah, Lefebvre, you know, is a very fascinating writer. I always think of the trouble with Lefebvre is he doesn't have a systematic theoretical way of understanding almost anything. What he has is a sort of a brilliant imagination with deep insights at various points. So I read Lefebvre not for, if you like, theoretical enlightenment. If I want theoretical enlightenment, I go read Marx and so on. I read Lefebvre for inspiration. He's an inspirational writer, and you can read pages of Lefebvre and say, I don't understand what the hell he is talking about. And then you come across a few pages which you say, God, that's brilliant. What a fantastic idea. What a fantastic way of understanding. So I find it very difficult to actually comment on any particular aspect of Lefebvre. I just, like I say, read him as an inspirational thinker with some, you know, and I've occasionally drawn on him, on his inspiration in I think, very important and key ways. But I don't turn to him for a systematic explanation of, say, where the crisis of capital came from and why it circulates geographically in the way that it does. I don't think you'll get much out of Lefebvre on understanding something of that sort. Yeah, oh yeah. Well, look, this is where the contradictions, I think, become terribly important. When you look at, say, Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela, all of them are beset by some very, very deep contradictions. They may have socialist objectives. but they're essentially trying to realize some of those socialist objectives in a very neoliberal world. Take the case of Ecuador. Many people feel that Ecuador should not move towards extractivism to the degree that it has in terms of using the oil, and having spent a little time in the oil fields of Amazonia, I have to say it's absolutely awful, environmentally disgraceful. But if you need the revenue to develop, say, a knowledge-based economy, then you have this kind of dilemma of where you're going to get the revenues from to do it. And so at that point, you are really caught in a contradiction. And I tend to divide contradictions into two sorts. One is what I would call problems which have solutions. That is, you can find some way of managing them okay. And then there are contradictions which take the form of predicaments. And a predicament is such that you get messed up whichever way you go. And you simply have a choice. If Ecuador decided not to extract any oil, it will be locked into total impoverishment. It will be locked into a disastrous economic situation. So that's that side of the predicament. If it exploits the oil, it's going into an environmental dilemma. So you're dealing with contradictory situations, and I would say that my experience in Ecuador is to say that the contradictions are heightened to the point where it's obvious what the nature of the contradictions are. And the idea that somehow or other you can come out of this with a pure socialist answer is ridiculous. And it's as ridiculous as kind of saying, well, we should go totally the other direction and come out of it with a totally neoliberal answer. So it's you're trying to manage the contradictions in a very difficult situation. And I think the same is true of Bolivia, and we've seen, I think, phases of the People's Revolution in the Citizens' Revolution in Ecuador, which were more radical than the current situation, and I think the same was true in Bolivia in the early phases of the Morales government. And of course in Venezuela there has been a real breakdown. I mean, it's a very difficult and dangerous situation, I think, in Venezuela right now. But remember also, there are many, many hostile forces out there. There are a lot of countries that are not supportive of Ecuador or Bolivia, and they're two small countries trying to make a difference in a very, very difficult and contradictory situation. So I have a lot of sympathy with that, even when I often find myself in profound disagreement with the choices they've made. I think the choices they made are understandable. But to call this socialist, I certainly would not call it socialist. At the moment, what Ecuador has done is to redistribute. Well, first off, Ecuador has captured far more of the oil, the value of the oil wealth than formerly was the case. Secondly, there's no question that it is redistributing a lot of that oil wealth to large segments of the population which were formerly basically marginalized and impoverished. So, it certainly has done that, but could it do more? My answer would be yes. One of the missions, I think, of our own research enterprise in Ecuador is precisely to explore in what ways we can contribute to understanding some of these contradictions and find a better way to manage them that comes out in a different kind of direction. For instance, one of the features which is very important and which actually came up here, of course, in Medellin today, is this whole kind of question of democratic governance and democratic rights. And so one of the themes we want to explore this year is, apart from the explicit, specific research agendas we're looking at, is the whole kind of question of local democracy. So we're going to have a summer convenio on the whole kind of notion of spaces of democracy. And the whole argument will be, in what ways can we actually help in some way define the deepening and the extension of democratic rights, because I think it's fairly clear that the Ecuadorian revolution has not gone anywhere near enough to establishing democratic consultancy procedures. And that was what I heard here in Medellin this morning too, that there's not enough local democracy, democratic rights are not assured, the right to the city is in jeopardy, and so on. And so there's a struggle over those questions, and I don't think those questions have been satisfactorily resolved in Bolivia, Ecuador, or Venezuela, and it's an ongoing thing. That is the other thing about contradictions, is they never disappear. I mean, you might like to think that you end up in a world where, there's no contradictions anymore. But frankly, I rather like contradictions. I mean, they create a great deal of tension, and it's out of those tensions that new things come, and that, so we have to be constantly working with them and inside of them, and that seems to me to be the way in which we should be looking at these projects in Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela, and one of the exciting things about working there, I would just tell you this, is that you can say things and discuss things in Ecuador that you dare not mention in the United States. So it's a great liberation to me to be able to actually talk about revolution without being put on an anti-terrorist watch list. And this is, I think, in the United States has become very, very repressive in certain ways. And yes, there are repressions in Bolivia and Ecuador and Venezuela, but they're nowhere near as kind of, across the board as we're finding with the surveillance structures and sort of free speech monitoring that's going on in the United States.
Profesor,
Professor, you have no idea of how grateful we are for your visit to our city. We are very grateful. We feel privileged to have listened to your ideas from your voice. We hope you come back to our university and our city. Thank you very much to the ones who were here.